Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lance Bush to discuss folk metaethics, experimental philosophy, and, in general, whether moral realism is the common sense view among non-philosophers. For the uninitiated, don't worry, we'll define this stuff in due course. Now, for those of you who don't know Lance, he recently received his PhD in social psychology from Cornell University. His dissertation, which I've linked in the description, is entitled Schrodinger's Categories, the Indeterminacy of Folk Metaethics. In there, he explores in depth issues relating to ordinary people's metaethical views. And finally, he also has a YouTube channel called Lance Independent, where he continually suppresses the truth of moral realism and unrighteousness. Anyway, with all that out of the way, welcome, Lance, and feel free to add anything to my little introduction there.
It is an interesting thing when I say that my PhD is in social psychology, because then people see me talking about philosophy, and that sounds a bit strange. So the first thing to say is, before I did the PhD in social psych, I did do a master's in philosophy at Tufts. So I do have some, and I also did philosophy as an undergrad as well, alongside psychology. So I do have some academic training in philosophy as well as psychology. But also, although I was in a psychology program, I had a lot of autonomy to explore research from an interdisciplinary perspective, and we will be talking about experimental philosophy. And so for me, philosophy and psychology go very much hand in hand, and I have continued with research and studies of and reading philosophy while I've continued in my psychological training and education as well. So for me, the two are very intertwined.
Awesome. Okay, so you mentioned experimental philosophy. So I guess we'll just start by defining that. Like, what is experimental philosophy?
So experimental philosophy I prefer to characterize it as a kind of movement rather than it having any specific methods or doctrines or anything like that. And it's a movement that arose within the academic tradition of philosophy, like within the analytic tradition primarily, within the past 20 years or so. And many people locate one of the first papers to be this paper by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch from 2001. It was this study on cultural differences in epistemology, so how people would respond to Gettier cases, that sort of thing. So it's been around for a little over 20 years now. So the way I like to characterize it is that it is the exploration of traditionally philosophical questions using empirical methods, typically the methods of the social sciences, especially the methods of psychology, but you do get other types of empirical inquiry that you could use, like, for instance, behavioral neuroscience and that sort of thing. So Josh Green is someone that is prominent in the field for using fMRI. So basically, what you're doing in experimental philosophy is you're conducting empirical research where there is some sort of philosophical angle that it's directed towards, or that is associated with the types of questions you're asking, or the ways in which you're employing those findings.
So you're largely studying like the views or perhaps stances and commitments, as I'll have you define in a second, of like non-philosophers or ordinary people or the folk. What are these stances and commitments that are supposed to be being studied?
Sure. So that is itself an open, both philosophical and empirical question. So you used several terms there, and I prefer the term non-philosopher. And so this is one way people have actually defined experimental philosophy, is that it's the study of the intuitions of the folk. I don't like the term the folk. That sounds strange to me. It's like, it sounds weirdly archaic. I don't really like saying, like, what if someone just said, "Hey, I studied the folk," no one, people would say, "What do you mean? What are the folk?" If you say ordinary people, that ordinary people as opposed to what? Something other than ordinary, or philosophers not ordinary people? So I don't like that terminology. So I prefer the term non-philosopher, because I think it's maximally descriptive about what it is these typical are the typical population that most of these studies are intended to be conducted on. It's people that lack formal training in academic philosophy. And a lot of the purpose of this experimental philosophical research is to solicit the philosophical intuitions of these people, of non-philosophers. Now, I have a lot of concerns with that type of language. And so, for instance, in my dissertation, I avoid all of that language. I avoid the language of intuition. And part of the reason for that is just because I don't like intuition as a philosophical term of art within academic philosophy. There's several reasons why. One is that the term intuition has colloquial usages that carry connotations and meanings that just don't comport with how philosophers are using the term. So philosophers might use the term intuition to mean something like a distinctive type of intellectual seeming. Maybe it's a non-inferential belief or a non-inferential disposition to judge something to be true, or it's something like that, where it has a more technical and precise meaning that's very different from a colloquial sense of an intuition, like a hunch or a gut feeling. Like someone could say, I have an intuition that there's something wrong with this car that you're considering buying, where it's like you think there's something wrong, but you don't know how to, like it. There might be some overlap in intended usage and how you would deploy that terminology, but one of them has this colloquial use that doesn't perfectly overlap. So I don't like it for that reason. I also don't like it because philosophers have this terminology sort of picked up. And so if you look at some of the critiques that some philosophers have leveled in the sort of meta-philosophy or philosophy of philosophy at the use of intuitions, is that what they pointed out is that philosophers have this almost revisionist conception of philosophical methods where we think back on the way philosophers have done everything with this characterization of like everybody everywhere was always saying this is intuitive and that's intuitive. And it's not so clear that that's the case. That intuition language, like the actual explicit use of intuition, is more recent. It more recently became super duper popular. I'm not saying no one ever used the word intuition before like 1950, but it sort of exploded in usage. And the problem is that there has never been, no one ever really got together to really sit down and formalize what exactly we're talking about when we talk about intuition. So an intuition could be a belief, it could be a disposition to believe, it could have a certain type of phenomenology, it could have a certain type of epistemic status, it could represent distinctive types of mental states. The problem is that there is no clear consensus, nor even any clear attempt at a consensus about what exactly we're talking about when we talk about intuitions. And while I don't just go all in on the view that, well, so we don't have a good characterization, therefore there's no such thing, or we don't use them in philosophy or something like that. What concerns me is that there just hasn't been enough meta-philosophical discussion about what exactly we're talking about. And as someone with a psychology background, when you say, I have an intuition that such and such, it sounds to me very much like a claim that, at least partially, it certainly can have philosophical content, but it also has psychological content. Like if I say, I have a feeling that, or an emotion that, or a belief that, or an attitude that, that's psychological terminology. And so if you're going to use this terminology, I think philosophers are kind of getting ahead of themselves by not being careful about what they're talking about when they talk about intuition. So there's two things there. I prefer the term non-philosopher over ordinary people and the folk for reasons that I hope are obvious. And then the second, I prefer not to use the term intuition because I think I guess you could say I'm sort of agnostic or undecided on what I think the status and nature of intuitions are metaphilosophically. But I think until we have at least sufficiently better resolution on that, where I could take some type of tentative stance, I would prefer not to. And so I tend to focus on the terms, at least the terms I use sort of operationally in my dissertation, of a stance and a commitment. I know it took me a while to get to that, but there's a lot of sort of ground clearing, especially for someone, both for people that aren't familiar with this and for people that are familiar with this, and people that are familiar with the experimental philosophy discussion. It might sound like I'm using a bunch of non-standard terminology because I am. So I talk about the stances and commitments of non-philosophers, not the intuitions of the folk. This is different terminology. Okay, so stances and commitments. These are, I give more explicit and careful characterizations of what I'm talking about in my writing. That it wouldn't be helpful for me to go into like a 20-minute discussion of exactly all the nuances. And so I'll try to give a sort of crude characterization. Very roughly, and I do mean very roughly, a stance is an explicit position that a person takes. So for instance, if you're a theist and you believe in God, and someone says, hey, do you believe in God? You're like, yeah. Then you have the stance that God exists. Whereas a commitment is something that's more like, and this could be construed in a number of ways, and I think any of these are consistent with saying you have a commitment. A commitment could be something like an implicit attitude or position that you would be committed to in virtue of the rest of your beliefs, or the way that you speak, or the way that you think, but that you wouldn't be able to explicitly articulate. And that doesn't represent a sort of conscious belief you do or readily could entertain without someone having to sort of extract it from you through like a Socratic dialogue or something like that. It's sort of buried in there somewhere psychologically, or even more minimally, there are characterizations of language, like ordinary language, where they make no claim on being having some sort of psychological reality where it's a characterization of any particular psychological state you have. Rather, it's a characterization of the meaning of the language that you're employing. And on those views, there can be characterizations of the way that you're using language, where the language you're using involves a commitment to or entails certain commitments to philosophical positions. Now, I don't actually endorse a view of language like that, but I don't think it would be reasonable for me to go about a mode of empirical inquiry where I'm reviewing research that may take on those presuppositions where, I'm imposing my views about language on what the researchers are doing. No, I got to follow what the researchers are intending to do. Unfortunately, in the empirical literature on metaethics, which is what I think we're going to be focused on, they're not very clear on what they're measuring. And so I draw this distinction, but unfortunately, the distinction, you won't see it in there. You might see references to intuition in a few papers, but a lot of times they'll talk about whether non-philosophers are moral realists or anti-realists, or whether they believe moral realism or anti-realism. They might say whether they're committed to it. And so they'll use language in a way where, unfortunately, there's rarely any attempt at being very precise or operationalizing the types of psychological states in abstract that is being attributed to people. So if we say that a person is a moral realist, are we saying that they have an explicit belief that moral realism is true? Or are we saying that they have some implicit predisposition to think and speak in a way consistent with realism? Or are we saying that the semantics of the language there that they employ involves a commitment? It's not clear. And unfortunately, the researchers studying this just are not clear on what it is they're trying to measure. So I have to adopt this language in order to try to be as theoretically neutral about what it is we're talking about as possible.
Yeah, that's good. Just a few brief things for the audience. So firstly, you mentioned like different accounts of intuition. I actually have a video where I went through the SEP entry in depth on intuition. So I highly recommend the audience to check that out. It's called Intuition and Analysis or something like that. So I'd recommend the audience to check that out for those who are interested in like intuitions and their evidential salience and what philosophers have conceived of them as being, etc. And with you, I prefer not to characterize experimental philosophy as studying intuitions of non-philosophers, just because responses to survey questions are very faint indicators of what philosophers mean by intuitions, like this like non-inferential intellectual seeming or something like that. One can have that sort of state and not believe the content of the state, or one can believe the content of the state even though it doesn't strike one as plausible in that kind of way. Alternatively, one could just be responding to the question on the basis of various pragmatic factors and various other things. So it's really studying folk responses to survey questions as indicative of perhaps their beliefs and stances and commitments as you define them. But I would say that's a faint indicator of their intuitions as philosophers use that. So I would also urge against intuition for that reason. And then just a brief summary for the audience. So we're going through what experimental philosophy is, then we're getting into what metaethics is, and then we're going to talk about the experimental philosophy of basically folk metaethical views, or the metaethical views or lack thereof of non-philosophers. I guess now we can turn to like metaethics and specifically folk metaethics. I know we said earlier that maybe we shouldn't be using the word folk, but that's the term that's caught on. So what is metaethics? And also like what is folk metaethics? So what are we studying here?
So metaethics is a branch of moral philosophy that deals with the sort of highest level of abstraction for addressing questions about morality. And it deals with questions about the fundamental nature of morality. So questions about what is morality? Are there moral truths? If so, how could we know them? So these very foundational and fundamental questions, as opposed to questions about, for instance, what are the correct set of moral principles that we should all subscribe to? Should we endorse deontology or utilitarianism? That deals with sort of one level down, and that's normative ethics. And then the third level down, typically there's a sort of tripartite distinction, is applied ethics, where you then could apply your normative principles to particular cases, like what should we do in cases like euthanasia and that sort of thing. And so there's a sort of tripartite division, and then metaethics sort of sits at the top or the bottom, however you want to organize things, where it's the more foundational or abstract questions about the nature of morality. Folk metaethics concerns these stances and commitments of non-philosophers. That's my preferred terminology anyway. And so roughly what that is about is, and I often just call it the psychology of metaethics, because I think that more explicitly characterizes how research on this is conducted and what the sort of point of it is. which is you could say though the linguistics of metaethics though if you wanted to, because these questions aren't necessarily exclusively psychological questions. In a certain sense, you could say it encompasses any empirical questions about how non-philosophers think about the nature of morality. That's what I would say folk metaethics is. A big part of that is going to be psychological questions. So, but we shouldn't exclude that anthropology is relevant to this, linguistics is relevant to this, neuroscience, history, even. We could do historical analysis. And so any field of inquiry that's looking at how non-philosophers think about the nature of morality would be relevant to folk metaethics. But my primary area of research and interest is specifically in the psychological literature. And what that has largely explored is unfortunately not super clear on what it is that it's trying to capture, whether it's a stance, a commitment, an intuition. And even if you did use specific terminology, people often aren't clear. So we could set that aside and say, very roughly, what researchers are trying to find out in the majority of this literature is whether or not non-philosophers, in a certain sense, are moral realists or are moral anti-realists, in the same sense that we might ask a psychological question about whether most people believe in God or don't believe in God. So a lot of it, I would say, seems to be about people's stances. But, as you say, if we're trying to measure their intuitions, well, there are a lot of ways that the research itself might not be a direct indicator of people's intuitions, if that is what we're interested in, because what we're really measuring are responses to surveys or responses to questions or behavior under certain sorts of conditions in which we've induced some sort of manipulation where we've like primed them with like reading a passage or saying something to them. And then we're observing behavior or things people say or do in response to us. And then we have to interpret that. And you could interpret that in accordance with with some conception of intuitions, but it could be something like belief states or implicit beliefs, explicit beliefs. It's not, unfortunately, literature is not super clear. So I'm sorry I can't give a decisive answer. But we could say, just for the sake of simplicity, we could focus roughly on belief in realism or anti-realism. I think that's a good starting point for simplifying things. And so I guess just real quick on that, most of the research in the psychology of metaethics, which I guess you could say is a large component of folk metaethics, is concerned with realism and anti-realism. But of course, that's not the only question in metaethics. There's also questions like, can we have moral knowledge? And if so, how could we acquire moral knowledge? There hasn't been a lot of research on that. There's also questions like, I'll give one more example because there is research on this. Are moral beliefs necessarily, even if defeasibly motivating, or are they only contingently motivating? And that's the motivational internalism, externalism dispute. And you could see how, if you're talking about human motivation, there's a good case to be made that there's empirical work to be done there, how people conceptualize that connection between belief and motivation. And there has been research on that. So there is folk metaethical research on things other than realism and anti-realism, but most of the research has been on moral realism and moral anti-realism.
Awesome. So yeah, we've used these terms like moral realism, moral anti-realism. So I wanted to give the audience just a brief lay of the land of some of the major metaethical views on offer before we get into some of this folk metaethical research and what it can tell us or what it can't tell us about these stances and commitments of non-philosophers regarding these metaethical questions. So these are relatively popular, relatively standard characterizations within the literature, but unfortunately, there isn't a single monolithic uniform understanding among metaethicists and philosophers, but these are pretty relatively standard. So moral realism, very roughly, is the view that there are stance-independent moral truths. So what does stance independence mean? Well, it basically just means that their truth value, the truth value of these claims or judgments or statements or propositions, like the proposition that torturing someone for fun is wrong, or that pleasure is bad, or things like that, the truth value of these statements is independent of anyone's preferences or beliefs or desires or attitudes or any other stances that they may have. In other words, they're not made true by or made false by anyone's stances. So yeah, they're true independently or false independently of anyone's stances. So that's what stance independence means. And then we also need to break down what a moral truth is. Roughly speaking, it's just a truth about which acts or states of affairs are good or bad or right or wrong. Or it's a truth about someone having like a moral reason to perform some action or to refrain from performing some action. Like you have a moral reason to give to the poor or something like that. So that's moral realism, the view that there are stance-independent moral truths. And moral anti-realism, by contrast, is just the denial of moral realism. It says there are no stance-independent moral truths. And there are, of course, specific brands of anti-realism. And these are probably going to come up later on, which is why I'm going to be covering them here. So you have, for instance, and I'm not giving a full survey, a full lay of the land, but here are some notable ones. There's individualist subjectivism. This view says that, yes, there are moral truths, but their truth value is stance-dependent, insofar as their truth value depends on one's own stances. For example, they might be dependent on one's own preferences or desires or normative standards or beliefs or what have you. There's also cultural relativism. This view says that there are moral truths, but their truth value depends on the stances of people in one's culture or society at large. There's also error theory, which says there are no moral truths at all. Instead, moral judgments are all systematically false. And finally, you also have non-cognitivism, which is the view that, yeah, there are no moral truths at all. And the reason for that is because moral judgments aren't even capable of having truth values. They're not even capable of being true or false, perhaps because they're mere expressions of emotion, perhaps because they're commands, or something like that. There are other views that one could get into, like quasi-realism and various other sorts of things, but I think that suffices for a brief lay of the land of some of the major or important views within metaethics. So I'll turn it over to you if you want to comment on any of that before we get into some of like the existing measures of folk metaethical views.
That sounded good to me. I don't think I have anything to add. I like that.
Okay, sweet. So yeah, now we're moving on to the part of the discussion where we actually discuss some of the empirical research that has been done on folk metaethics. We were basically going broad and getting more and more narrow and more specific. We started out by talking about, hey, what is experimental philosophy and what are we trying to study? Well, we're studying the stances and commitments of ordinary people or folk or non-philosophers. And in particular, we're studying that with respect to the metaethical views of people. And in particular, metaethical views typically with respect to moral realism or moral anti-realism. So that's really what we're getting into. We're getting more and more narrow. So let's go through some of the existing measures of folk metaethical views. And perhaps we can start with the disagreement paradigm, which is chapter 2 of your dissertation. So I'll turn over to you. What is the disagreement paradigm? What's it supposed to tell us? What have been some of the findings there?
Awesome. Okay, so the disagreement paradigm is the main paradigm or method that has been used in an attempt to evaluate whether non-philosophers are moral realists or moral anti-realists. And the way that this works is roughly that the idea is that moral disagreements, the existence of moral disagreements, is supposed to be a good indicator of a person's metaethical views. If a person thinks that if two people who disagree, they have different conclusions about a particular moral issue, could both be correct, this would be this would indicate in some way that that person may not be a moral realist because they seem to think that two conflicting moral standards could simultaneously both be true. Now, that might mean that the person is some type of moral relativist, for instance, and that they don't think that there is a single stance-independent standard of moral truth. So that would be how you would interpret that if they think that both people could be correct. But if they think that if two people disagree, that at least one of them must be incorrect, this would seem to imply that the person does not think that conflicting standards could be equally correct, and that at most there's only one correct moral standard. And that could be interpreted as an indication that the person thinks that there is a single stance-independent moral standard. Now, if you're concerned with that single versus more than one standard, that is a potential concern for the way that this is framed. But there are a bunch of other methodological concerns with that. But let me give a sort of rough example of the way that this would work. So one of the things that's interesting about this approach is that it's not simply used to find out if a person is a realist or an anti-realist about morality as a whole. It can actually be used to see if the person takes a realist or an anti-realist perspective towards particular moral issues. And traditionally in the literature, I say traditionally, but it's only been around for like 15 years or so. But what you would do is you would give people a concrete moral disagreement. And this could be one way that's commonly used is to ask the person about their own moral standards. So you give them a bunch of moral issues, and then you say, how much do you agree or disagree that this particular action is right or is morally right or wrong? And it could be stuff like murder and stuff where the person's going to say it's all wrong, and then stuff where they're going to say it's not wrong. And then you could get ones that are more controversial, where you would expect a great degree of individual differences in participants where large numbers of people agree and large numbers disagree. And that could be something like abortion or euthanasia, where it's very polarizing, the stances that people take on the issue. So you give them a whole bunch of issues like that, and then you ask them about their agreement or disagreement. And then you tell them, hey, by the way, we gathered this data in a previous pool of participants, and we found a participant that disagreed with you about this issue. And now we would like to know whether you think that both you and that participant can be correct, or whether at least one of you has to be incorrect. That's one way of framing it. That you could call the first person disagreement paradigm. But I prefer the third person disagreement paradigm because it's a little, I think, easier to process what exactly is being stated. And so the way that that would work would be something like this. So imagine we have the scenario. Alex says that murder is wrong. Sam says that murder is not wrong. Is it possible for both Alex and Sam to be correct, or must at least one of them be mistaken? And then typically, a person would be given two response options. One response option would be they can both be correct. Alex and Sam can both be correct. And then the other response option would be at least one of them must be incorrect. And then that would be used to sort people as realists or anti-realists about that particular issue. And then what you would do is you would ask the person about 10 or 15, a bunch of scenarios. You can use as many as you want, as many of persons willing to answer. And then you get a sort of overall index of the proportion of responses they give a realist response to and an anti-realist response to. Now, when this research has been conducted, typically what they've done is they've given people a cluster of prototypical moral issues like lying and stealing and killing and that sort of thing. But then they also give people taste and aesthetic questions, so questions about music and like Da Vinci paintings and food preferences. And they ask people about disagreements about those. So one person likes pineapple on their pizza, another person doesn't. Do you think they could both be correct? That sort of thing. And then you can ask them about factual issues like the age of the earth or 2 + 2 = 4, that sort of thing. And then you could also ask them about social conventions. So, a person goes to work wearing a clown costume. Would that be socially appropriate? Well, if they're a professional clown, maybe. But if it's a different job, then maybe that would be an unusual thing for a person to do. And so you have those four sort of categories: social conventions, morals, aesthetics, and taste domain. And then you could say sort of like factual issues. And then you can sort of compare what is the overall like proportion of realist responses people give for moral issues compared to these others. Now, this is the method that was used in Goodwin and Darley in their 2008 paper. And that's really the paper that got all of this research rolling. There is some research before that in 2003, 2004, and there's even a few studies that go back further. But that one, for whatever reason, that's what got all of this started. And what they found is that the overall proportion of realist responses that people gave on average for moral issues was intermediate between the sort of factual issues and the taste and aesthetic issues. I believe they used for that. Maybe it was social conventions, but it was between the two. And so one conclusion you might have is that, well, people seem more realist about moral issues than they do about taste and aesthetic preferences, but they're slightly less of a realist than they are about sort of factual issues about science or mathematics or something like that. So that could be a sort of takeaway from that research. But the issue with that is that it's a little weird to treat people as being like kind of a realist, or to sort of have these sort of aggregate measures without carefully attending to what it is that people were judging. So, if you have 10 issues and a person is very strongly a realist towards 4 of them, and then kind of a lukewarm anti-realist towards 6 of them, and the average is like slightly in favor of realism, is the person more of a realist? Well, they're a realist about less issues, but they're just more confident or stronger in their realism. So it turns out the data is really, really messy. But the overall theme that you get when you ask people about multiple concrete moral issues is that they give realist responses to some of them and anti-realist responses to others. And that is what most of the research has shown up until very, very recently, where things started to get a little more complicated. And I guess that's part of what we're going to be talking about. So I'll switch over to talking roughly about the sort of overall findings. And the overall findings result in what people in the literature have called metaethical pluralism. And roughly, the one type that I've described so far is what you could call intrapersonal pluralism, which is that people appear to give realist responses for some moral issues and anti-realist responses for other moral issues. If you do ask about morality as a whole, for most of the studies, you do get overall more people give anti-realist responses than realist responses. So something is interesting there. But that's intrapersonal. The people give realist responses to some things, anti-realist responses to others. You also have interpersonal, which is variation between individuals. So some people give overall a greater tendency of realist responses, and other people give overall a greater tendency of anti-realist responses. And that would be more like saying, hey, some people think like realists, and some other people think like anti-realists, which maybe isn't too surprising of a finding. So you get those two types of pluralism. So that is what you could say is state of the literature, sort of at the time I started diving into it. But there's been further developments, and there are new paradigms beyond the disagreement paradigm. So I guess I'll stop there and see if there's more to say about the disagreement paradigm.
No, I think that suffices for kind of basically giving a lay of the land of what the paradigm is and what kind of the major findings have been. And I sort of want to do that for each of these various different measures of folk metaethical views. And for each one, we're going to pause to go through some potential methodological flaws or at least limitations, and problems for the validity of these measures. So maybe we should get onto that right now. I mean, maybe I could just pick some that immediately come to mind. And I'm hoping that these can basically just serve the audience and help them think critically about like not only experimental philosophical research, but like also, I don't know, social psychological research at large and whatnot. Just being aware of various confounding factors, being aware of different problems that afflict the validity of certain measures, and so on. So four that immediately come to mind that I'll bring up, and then I'll have you kind of maybe elaborate upon them and then talk about potential others if you want. So the first one is about like the representativeness of the sample that we're testing these questions on. As is well known, these questions are usually on just like American college students very often, and sometimes people on like Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And almost always these sorts of studies then are being done on what psychologists call weird populations, which are Western. So weird, it's an acronym, WEIRD. It's an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So it's Western and educated people from industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, basically. And that's largely what we're studying on. And I think, as you're probably going to elaborate upon, like various independent psychological research at least seems to indicate that people from weird populations like reliably anchor on one end of the distribution with respect to various psychological measures. So they seem to be quite unrepresentative. At least we have some good reason to think that they are not representative of the broader population at large. So that's one potential issue that comes to my mind. Maybe I should just turn it over to you to talk about that one a little bit, and then we can go through the three others that I identified and then potential others that you can identify. So
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. You set that up very well. So this weird problem is a problem for psychological research because most psychological research historically has been conducted on populations that come from particular parts of the world where they exhibit cultural characteristics that are idiosyncratic with respect to the rest of the world. In other words, it's about people from weird cultures make up about 12% of the world's population. One thing to say about that too is also like the degree to which any given population is weird is really more a matter of degree, like many things. We can try to make these categorical distinctions, but really it's more of a continuum where different cultures vary in the degree to which they exhibit various types of cultural influences. And some cultures you could say are more weird than others, but most of the research has actually been conducted in the United States or the UK or other places that aren't just like somewhere on the weird spectrum, but they're on the further end of it. So they're like, you could say they're the weirdest of the weird. Now that term, it's not intended to be like critical of the culture itself. It's just intended as a descriptive characterization of those particular cultures. Now, what the proponents of this weird proposal, Henrik Heine and Noren Zion, have done is they gathered and aggregated all of the research people have done in cross-cultural research to genuinely go out and seek different populations around the world that are more psychologically representative of humanity as a whole. And what they tend to find when this research is conducted is that for many of the issues that figure into a lot of the traditional type of psychological paradigms that have been conducted, it's not simply like people from weird populations are just sort of randomly somewhere in the mix, or that they tend to fall somewhere in the middle of a normal distribution. Rather, it's that if you have some measure that goes from high to low, people from weird populations will tend to be the lowest out of like 20 different populations or the highest out of 20 different populations. So they're not just somewhere randomly in there that may or may not be particularly representative of humanity as a whole. They are, in fact, frequently the least representative population, psychologically speaking, of any population, large population we could have opted to study. So that makes them, it doesn't make the populations you studied poor candidates for psychological research. It's just that we need to contextualize what it is our findings can tell us when we gather that research. Research on people from weird populations tells us about people from weird populations. it may or may not generalize to other populations. There are probably lots of basic features of human psychology, it'd be remarkable if there weren't, that are going to be shared all over the world, right? And so you would find all these things that are similar between everybody. But lots of the things that psychologists choose to study, they're choosing to study because they are of interest and may not be the most obvious things to find in the world. And they are, in other words, we might be seeing a kind of selection effect where the research where we looked for these differences happens to be research where it's the best candidates for finding these differences. And so the fact that we find them doesn't mean that psychologically speaking, everybody all over the world is totally different from everybody else. That is not at all what the claim is. The claim is that for any given psychological claim, we can't simply presume that if one particular population or people that are members of one particular cultural or demographic group exhibit certain psychological characteristics, that therefore we can be super confident other populations will exhibit those characteristics. That is itself an empirical claim, and that claim itself would need to be justified by an appropriately comprehensive degree of cross-cultural data. Unfortunately, the cross-cultural data raises substantial concern for doubt, including a lot of research, not on metaethics directly, but on human moral psychology, which differs all around the world. So that's one big factor here, is that if we have specific evidence that a lot of pro-social and social and moral behavior and like people's mental states differ around the world, then we should be very cautious about presuming everybody would have the same metaethics. And I should add, as one final point about just how substantial and broad these differences are, these differences even include like visual perception. So we've even found that people around the world, given your cultural background, you can actually perceive visual objects in ways where your judgments about them differ from people from other cultures. And so these psychological differences are potentially quite significant and broad and in what sorts of psychological differences you could find. So yeah, it's a huge problem of generalizability that most of our research is conducted on weird populations. The last point about that is it's not just conducted on weird populations, it's also primarily conducted by people from weird populations. And that's not a nothing factor. That's important. Because when you yourself, when all of the researchers share a particular cultural background, that influences the kinds of hypotheses they ask, how they interpret their data, how they frame their questions, how they word their questions. And all of those potential risks of a sort of cultural narrowness in the perspectives that they're taking can influence the way that they're addressing these sorts of questions.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a point about generalizability of the findings. Now, I was thinking my other 3 points were about certain confounding factors that could potentially render the measures invalid. Before we get into those, can you just define very briefly for the audience what is like a confound, or what is a confounding factor? And secondly, what are we talking about when we talk about the validity of a measure?
Yeah, and this might not be a good technical definition, but if someone says, hey, this study has confounds, what I would say is that when researchers are making an active effort to isolate the factors that they are employing to account for some observations or phenomenon, often what you have is an inability, given the way that they've structured their data, to account for the possibility that other explanations could account for the data as well. Because they intervene in whatever interventions or measures were employed in some way that might be non-obvious or might not be easy to extricate and notice. And so you would have to conduct further research in an attempt to isolate different possible influences on whatever outcome measures you're looking at in order to figure out which ones are actually driving the measures that you're employing.
Yeah, it's sort of like a factor that influences your results, which can sort of make them almost seem misleading in a certain way. Like you think you're measuring, for instance, folk metaethical views, when there may be a certain factor influencing the results in a kind of systematic way, which isn't the folk metaethical views that you're trying to measure.
Right. And so the big factor that I focus on in my research is unintended interpretations, but there are plenty of other potential confounds in research, but I just focus on those for the most part. That would be roughly what I would say about what confounds are. And then as far as validity, very roughly, validity it's not the same thing for someone with a philosophy background, where validity has to do with the structural relations of like premises and conclusions. Validity in psychology has to do with whether the measure you're employing actually measures what it is intended to measure. So by analogy, a thermometer is a valid measure of the temperature to the extent that it accurately captures the temperature. Like if it's not a good measure of the temperature, then it's not a valid measure of the temperature. So it's roughly a sort of normative evaluation of the degree to which the method you're employing actually does what it's intended to do.
Yeah, like does the experiment really measure what it claims to measure in some sense.
Right.
Okay,
And so that,
sweet.
yeah, so that roughly is what I would say that validity is all about.
I just wanted to get that because we were going to talk about certain confounds, which cast doubt on the validity of the disagreement paradigm as a measure of folk psychological views. So that's what we're getting into. So three that immediately come to my mind, and I'll have you potentially go through more. But one of them is what we might call, I don't know what you call them in your dissertation because I only read like the first chapter or two. So, but one of them, we could call it like the tolerance confound. So like some of these questions are going to be controversial questions about like abortion or euthanasia or what have you. And it's like Alex and Sam disagree about abortion. Alex thinks abortion is morally wrong. Sam doesn't think it's morally wrong. Do you think one of them is incorrect, or do you think one of them has to be incorrect, or do you think both of them can be correct? I mean, a lot of these people who are being studied, like for instance, college students, may very well be thinking, well, I mean, it's like even if I have a determinate view on this question, and even if I think the other person is incorrect, like I don't want to come off as a mean, but like an intolerant person. I don't want to say they have to be incorrect or like this person just is totally wrong, you know? So they might give a question which seems to the researchers to indicate an anti-realist response by saying that they could both be correct, when in reality, that's just exhibiting a kind of tolerance on their end when they actually do in fact hold a determinate view and they think that the other person is mistaken, but they're just trying to sort of, I don't know, hedge, kind of be nice, be a little bit conciliatory, and try to be tolerant. Like that's the tolerant thing to do here in this sort of response. So and so instead of, you know, you could see how that kind of confounds the what you're trying to measure. So anyway, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. So that captures one thing. In psychology, we might call that social desirability. So it could be that one of the factors that drives people's responses when they're responding to questions is a desire to say things where they don't want to sound like a bad person or they don't want to upset the researcher. There's other things that people might want to try to do. Sometimes people are, you could call these demand characteristics. People will be trying to infer what the researcher's intentions are and then try to respond accordingly or subversively. So if you think the researcher is asking you a particular sort of question or they have a particular kind of goal, you may be motivated to try to give them the answer that you think that they want. So that could influence the way that you respond to questions. You may think that they want a particular thing, and then you might want to mess with them by giving the opposite. So people really do this in research. You know, you could ask people questions and you'll always get a proportion of people, no matter how silly the question is, where they'll pick some really strange response like that you think the moon doesn't exist or something like that. People, if you ask, does the moon exist? You're going to get a consistent number of people that are just going to say, no, there's no moon. So you do get that. And then you do get people that, in the particular case of presenting people with controversial moral issues, might be thinking, well, I don't want to say the other person's wrong because I would feel like a jerk, or I might seem rigid or intolerant, or like I'm not a nice person. And so I'm going to say we could both be correct. And if that's the case, the motivation for the person saying both people could be correct is not that they're a moral anti-realist. It's that they're thinking, I don't want to give a response on a survey that makes me look like a jerk. And all of these factors can influence people. Now, the first couple of factors that I mentioned, these are general problems for psychological research, where it might be a general feature of any type of research where this context is present, where people are trying to infer the intentions and then respond in some way or another on the basis of that in a way that undermines the intentions of the study. And the second case where people might not want to look like jerks. Both of these factors, though, they might not be super big factors on their own. They could be that what they do is they introduce a little bit of noise into psychological research. And so if you hear, okay, maybe people are doing this, maybe people are doing that, one is maybe isn't a very compelling type of critique of a study, that maybe some people are doing a particular thing. But two, even if they are, it's unlikely that it's happening at such, a great extent for any one of these particular things that we should be really skeptical of the findings. Like, sure, okay, maybe people are concerned about that, so we shouldn't do the studies. One of the things that I want to stress about the disagreement paradigm in particular, though, is that there are so many potential confounds that even if all of them individually comprise rather small influences, to the extent that they're non-overlapping with one another, the cumulative effect of a bunch of small issues, it's like death by 1,000 methodological cuts, where if it has 25 problems. I think I mentioned 28 problems in the dissertation, which I don't even think it all made it into the main text because there was just too many. And some of them are actually pretty serious on their own, but these small effects are all potential factors. But there's another major confound very closely related to the tolerance one, which is this. I call it a normative confound.
Yeah.
And so the normative confound is when the purpose of the disagreement paradigm is to ask a metaethical question. You want to know whether the person thinks moral facts are stance independent or stance dependent, or maybe neither, if they're some type of expressivist or something like that. But the problem is that if you tell someone, hey, do you think, you ask them, hey, do you think murder's wrong? And they're like, yes. And then you say, hey, this previous participant, they said they don't think murder's wrong. Do you think you could both be correct? Or it must at least one of you be wrong? One thing a person might think is, yeah, they're wrong. So of course one of us is incorrect. That person's incorrect. Now notice with that you may just be expressing your own normative stance. Even if you're an anti-realist, let's say you're an appraiser relativist, and you think that moral facts are facts about, the standards of individuals such as yourself, and someone says, given your moral views, do you think you and another person could both be correct about whether murder is right or wrong? The answer for, again, a relativist, they're an anti-realist, is no, I'm correct, and they're not. And there's no inconsistency there because you're expressing your normative moral standards. You're not speaking at the level of metaethics. And many of the ways and I think we'll get to this, when participants explained why they answered questions in these ways, they did hint at that being a reason or the rationale for why they judged another person to be incorrect, which is that they would simply say the other person has incorrect moral standards, or I don't like the other person's view. They might even say things like, yeah, the other person's a jerk. I don't like them. That's not telling you anything in any way indicating a metaethical stance. You're just saying, I don't like that other person. So that is another major confound that's pretty similar, but we can move into some others. I think you had some others
Yeah.
you wanted to
No,
talk
I mean,
about.
the normative one is one of the biggest ones. I mean, like, we cannot infer that someone is a realist merely from the fact, as you point out, that they have certain normative views and they think others are mistaken, right? I mean, an individual subjectivist, as we defined it at the outset, right, can definitely think that, hey, yeah, like it really is the case that murder is wrong. Of course, it's not stance independently the case, but it is the case. And so anyone who says otherwise is mistaken. And so they could basically, I mean, that's what they could say. Its truth is stance dependent, of course, but they're mistaken and they have the wrong normative standards because they're, for instance, inconsistent with my own preferences or desires or standards or beliefs. And that's what morality is a function of for the individualist subjectivist. A cultural relativist, this is another sort of confound. I mean, like someone could be thinking, if they're a cultural relativist, they might say that the other person is wrong. Because their view is at odds with the culture's views at large, right? So then the researchers would interpret their view as a kind of realist response because they're saying, hey, one of us has to be incorrect, even though they're an anti-realist, right? They're a cultural relativist. So they think the truth value of moral claims varies systematically by which culture they're indexed to or what have you. And yet they're going to be responding in this sort of way, which to the people who are trying to interpret the study think is a realist type response. But again, it's not. So anyway, I just want the audience to be aware that merely from the fact that someone has certain normative commitments, like torture is wrong, or you shouldn't kick puppies, things like that, you cannot infer that they're a realist because you'd have to go an extra step by showing that they think that that's a stance-independent moral fact or something like that. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. So on that note about cultural relativism, one of the things that, well, first I should set up exactly why that is a particular issue. Now, if you're a cultural relativist, you are not committed to saying that if two people disagree, they could both be correct, because it depends which moral standards they are relativizing their claims to. What if the two people are members of the same culture? If I say Alex and Sam are both members of the same culture, Alex says X is wrong, Sam says X is not wrong, can they both be correct? The answer for a cultural relativist ought to be no, they can't both be correct because both of their standards are indexed to the same culture. So no, they couldn't both be correct. So here's what's strange about that. That study I mentioned, the Goodwin and Durley 2008 study, they explicitly told the participants that the person is a member of the same culture. So if you're a culture relativist, given the instructions that you were given in the study, you ought to say that at least one person is mistaken, which is rather strange. So that is fortunately, that's one of the kinds of confounds that is circumventable. You can just specify with clearer instructions that the other person is a member of a different culture, and then you don't have that same issue. So that one at least you can get around. But there are other issues. I don't know how many more you want to get into.
Maybe just two others two others that I had, and then I'll turn it over to you for like the one or two biggest ones that you see other than the normative confound. So one of them is what we could call like an epistemic confound. Like, I mean, listen, I have certain, let's say, controversial ethical views. I'm not going to say them because I need a job eventually, right? But I have certain controversial moral views. And there are certain senses in which I can definitely say, even though, I lean towards realism and whatnot, I can definitely say, yeah, the other person could be correct on this question, even though they disagree with me. And I also could be correct. I'm just sort of making an epistemic claim, like it's epistemically possible that I'm wrong. And maybe the other person in principle could be right. And maybe I'm wrong, right? So I'm just kind of evincing some epistemic humility. So there is a sense in which I could truly say both of us could be correct, in the sense that each of us is such that we could have the correct view. And of course, if that person were correct, I'd be wrong. And if I were correct, that person would be wrong. So I'm not saying both of them could be correct simultaneously, but there is an ordinary English way in which you could say both could be correct. Like, both teams could win the Super Bowl, like before the Super Bowl has happened, both teams could win. Like it could be the Colts or it could be the Broncos. Both teams could win. I'm not saying both of them could simultaneously win. I'm just saying like each individual one is such that that one could win. And of course, if it wins, the other one would be wrong. But, epistemically speaking, each one might win. So, even though I have a controversial stance, and even though I even think it stands independently true, let's say, I could still respond by saying, yeah, technically speaking, we both could be correct. Like in the sense that I could be wrong and the other person could be right, whereas they could be wrong and I could be right. So there's that sort of confound. Alternative view for that one.
Yeah, so that is one of the main ones that I discuss, and there actually is some empirical evidence suggestive that it may be in play in the way that some people are responding to these. So I call that, it's a term coined by one of my colleagues. I don't know where exactly he got the term, but he says this is a case of potential modal operator scope ambiguity. So this is my colleague Tyler Milhouse employed this term. It's a big, heavy duty term, but you actually gave a fantastic example when you mentioned the Super Bowl of why this could be a potential issue. So the potential issue is that when you say, could X and Y both be the case, that is actually ambiguous between two possible readings, which is an inclusive reading and an exclusive reading. So the examples I think I give in my work is actually pretty similar to the Super Bowl, because I talk about like the World Cup or the World, I don't even remember if I think I talk about the World Cup. And so you can imagine two teams competing. Let's say it's the Super Bowl and you have two teams competing. And I ask you, could both teams win the Super Bowl? Now, that is still a little ambiguous, but if someone understands me to be asking, could both teams win the Super Bowl at the same time and in the same respect, the answer is going to be, what's the answer going to be?
No, they could not.
Right, they can't. Why? Because only one team can win. That's the way that the game is structured. There's only one winner. But suppose I have two guests over, or let's say this makes it even easier. Two people go to a restaurant, and let's just say the restaurant is very well stocked, and they both order mashed potatoes. Could both people have mashed potatoes? Now, does that mean that either one of them or the other has mashed potatoes? No, they could both have mashed potatoes at the same time. They simply one gets one serving, one gets the other serving. There isn't one mashed potatoes that only one or the other person can have. And so what you see is the first is an exclusive reading of could they both X? And then the second one is an inclusive reading of could they both X? On one interpretation, one way of resolving the ambiguity is could it be one or the other, but not both? And the other is, could it be one or the other or both? And those are just different interpretations. Now, the interesting thing about that is that we typically, when we are speaking in ordinary English, at least, I don't know how other languages grammatically would handle this. Maybe they are structured in a way where the ambiguity doesn't arise. Typically for us, this isn't really ambiguous because most of the time people have sufficient contextual knowledge where they understand that the Super Bowl is an exclusive reading and ordering food at a restaurant is an inclusive reading. And so typically background knowledge fleshes out and resolves the ambiguity sort of preemptively. And so these problems don't typically arise. But the issue is that those contextual factors are carried by background pragmatic considerations, not by the structure of the sentences. And so the problem is that researchers giving sentences to people that are intended to have a very precise, formal, technical interpretation, they're giving people outside a context in which participants, keep in mind, these are non-philosophers, being asked a highly sophisticated, technical, philosophical question using what looks like ordinary language in a somewhat awkward and contrived scenario. So you're getting this weird, like, where is the real context here? And so when that context can't get fleshed out, it's unclear whether people have an inclusive or exclusive interpretation of the question. Now, here, so James Beebe has done research that really highlighted the serious concern with this being an issue. Here's what James Beebe did, and I think this was Awesome. So what BB did, it's like my favorite finding in all this literature, by the way. So look forward to nothing being funnier than this finding. Okay, sorry to disappoint people. But so what James Beebe did with colleagues, I think, for some of these studies, is participants were asked this question. And so remember, we had the moral questions, but then they were asked about factual issues. And one of the factual issues that James Beebe opted for was a historical question. Did Caesar drink wine on his 21st birthday? Now, we have no way of knowing whether Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday. It's like asking, like, did George Washington brush his teeth on July 17th? Like no one is going to know at exactly 5:22 p.m. No one would know. And so you ask people an answer, you ask people a question where the answer is practically unknowable. Like there's not a real way to know. And so when you ask people that, you get a scenario like this. Alex and Sam disagree about whether Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday. Alex thinks Caesar did drink wine on his 21st birthday. Sam thinks Caesar did not drink wine on his 21st birthday. Do you think they could both be correct, or must at least one of them be incorrect? Now, I don't know, Joe, if you know the answer to the proportion of people that said they could both be correct. Do you know what it is?
I don't know what the proportion is, but it's hilariously high.
Okay, so if the question is interpreted as intended, what should that answer be? Probably pretty low, right? Because if people are saying they could both be correct, this would imply that people are historical relativists that believe that both simultaneously a particular historical event both did and did not happen, and whether or not it happened or didn't happen is relative to your personal beliefs and attitudes. So if you believe Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday, then he in fact, as a historical matter of fact, did so. And if you don't believe it, then he didn't. That's really bizarre. So like maybe people think that, but I think that if we get a finding that suggests a person thinks that, we should think it's more likely there's a problem with our method than that the person really thinks that. And I think that's totally reasonable. This is why philosophy is important for psychological research. Anyway, I think it's about 45%, nearly half of people had this reaction. And this was replicated in, I think, China, Poland, and Ecuador. They found very similar findings of about half of people giving that response. So this was even replicated across cultures. So about half of people are historical relativists. I don't think so. I think it's much more plausible that given the context of the question, they gave an inclusive reading rather than an exclusive reading. And so they interpret it sorry, I think I have that flipped. Well, what they're basically thinking is that it could be that either this person is correct or, exclusive reading. I did get it flipped. Either this person is correct and Caesar did drink wine on his 21st birthday, or this person is correct and Caesar did not drink wine on his 21st birthday, but it can't be that both of them are correct. And that is a perfectly sensible, like if someone, and the example I give in my own work is I say, look, let's say a person flips a coin. Could the coin land on heads or tails? Yeah, of course it could land on heads or tails. But clearly I mean that in an exclusive sense. It's not like you flip the coin and it's on heads and tails. It's not like a Schrodinger's coin. And so clearly in this case, the context that you know that a coin can only land in normal circumstances on one or the other side is going to resolve the ambiguity. So if that sounds super technical, it kind of is, but it's also the kind of thing that flies under the radar of a lot of psychological research. So much of the psychological, like methodological criticisms we focus on in psychology are, is the p-value low enough? Is there p-hacking going on? There's all these problems focusing on the way that we're analyzing the data. And there's often an inadequate attention to the way that we design our measures. And when you carefully attend to the way that you devise your measures, you could notice really serious and massive confounds that like, look, if it's half for that, how many people are giving exclusive readings for the moral questions? The answer is, I have absolutely no idea, and neither does anyone else. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, and one way to get clued into that, these potential confounds, is to basically ask your participants, what did you think? How did you interpret that question? Can you explain further your response a little bit? This other person in a previous study responded in this way. How do you think they interpreted the question? Like those sorts of things. So can you talk a little bit about open response data and its utility and some of what it's allowed us to find? Some of what we've learned on the basis of your own research in this. So that's the first question. And then after that, we're going to get into the Polzler and Wright 2020 paper that about consistent anti-realism. I just wanted to, I want to talk about that one a little bit. Yeah.
Awesome. That's like my favorite paper on this topic. So the BB finding is my favorite finding. That's my favorite paper. Okay, so what I ended up doing in my dissertation research is I did a variety of studies. I have a variety of other paradigms that I employ, but a big chunk of the dissertation is focused on the evaluation of open response questions. So an open response question is where the participant is given the opportunity to express or write out their response, like in their own words. They type in their response instead of responding to like a multiple choice question or like a yes, no, or a true, false, or something like that. They actually write out a response. And what I did with these questions is I used them to evaluate how participants interpreted the questions that they were asked. Now, what I actually did is I started with, I've mentioned this Goodwin and Darley paper several times. They actually did something really awesome, which is they gathered their own open response data. And one of the things they did for the disagreement paradigm is they asked the participants why they thought that the other person disagreed with them. And it's a really cool question to ask. Now, when they analyzed that data, what they basically reported virtually everybody interpreted it as intended. So I asked Jeff Goodwin for that data, and he was kind enough to share it with me, probably expecting I was going to criticize it, which I did. So I reanalyzed that data. I had my colleagues reanalyze that data as well. And so that's the first thing that we did is we reanalyzed someone else's data for their open response questions. Now, for that particular question, why do you think the other person disagreed with you? It's necessary for the validity of the study that you attribute the disagreement to a disagreement in your moral beliefs or values. That's not very complicated. It's not a very high bar. You simply have to say, well, why do you think the person disagreed with you? Well, they had different moral standards than me. That's it. That's all you have, some way of saying that. Now, when you actually, when I went and looked at that data, you had a variety of other responses. You did have a couple people say things like, well, the other person misunderstood the question, which is understandable if the other person is saying that they think murder is not wrong. Now, murder isn't actually one of the cases, but there's some pretty serious stuff in there, and they're told a person didn't think it was wrong. But a lot of times people would, and this was one of the big factors there, and this is one of those confounds that emerges from the disagreement paradigm that we didn't already mention, is contextual differences. So many times what a person would say is something like, well, so one of the scenarios is a person shooting a gun into a crowd of people, and when the person said both people can be correct, me and the other person that thinks it's okay, they would say things like, well, maybe, I was imagining like a criminal shooting at innocent people, and that's why I said it was wrong. But maybe they're imagining a person that's like, firing at a terrorist or something like that. And so then it might be, maybe that person thought that was morally acceptable, regardless of whether the participant agrees with them. The point is that the participant is saying that the reason that they came to different conclusions is because they were imagining the overall action occurring in different contexts. Now, the problem is that that is not an indication that the person is an anti-realist. What it's an indication of is that the two people are talking past one another. They're not really disagreeing about the same case. They're just, one person is saying, well, this action might be okay in this case, and this action wouldn't be okay in this other case. For example, someone might think it's okay to steal, a small amount of food in order to save your life, but it's not okay to steal a small amount of food in order, like, just for fun. And so if a person thinks that does not make the person an anti-realist just because they think a category of action could be right given some considerations and wrong given other considerations. They could think it's stance independently wrong to do it under these considerations, but not stance independently wrong on these other considerations. Anyway, I don't want to overcomplicate it too much. Just the point is, many people would attribute the cause of the disagreement to something other than a difference in moral values. But there's other, things that people would say for what they thought the source of disagreement was. But the overall rate is like, very, very few people we judged to have clearly interpreted the question as intended because they attributed the source of disagreement to something other than a difference in moral values. And in many other cases, it just wasn't clear. And so you can't tell one way or the other. The problem, though, is that if you have something, we found maybe a quarter of people were interpreting the source of disagreement as intended in a clear way. That raises serious questions about the validity of the study because we can no longer be particularly confident in light of those findings whether people were really understanding the nature of the moral disagreement in the way that would be necessary for the validity of the study.
Yeah, definitely. So you're kind of just highlighting the overarching problem of unintended interpretations, where the audience just interprets the question or certain potential responses that they're given that they could select in response to the question. The participant interprets those in ways that are not intended by the researchers. And that is a huge methodological problem that afflicts a lot of this psychological research on and experimental philosophy research on folk metaethical views. So how about now we get into before we get into, which is the next thing, before we get into like how you argue for folk metaethical indeterminacy, and don't worry for the audience, we'll explain what that is. Let's just briefly talk a little bit about the Polzler Wright 2020 paper, which, you know, was very surprising to me when I first heard it, because before I looked into all this research and whatnot, before I started thinking very deeply about the common sense views, I fell into that trope common among armchair philosophers that, yeah, basically everyone's a moral realist, whether implicitly or explicitly. But then when I heard this, I was like, whoa, around 3/4 of participants consistently favored anti-realist responses. So I'll turn it over to you. Like, what is this study? What did they do? And what did they find? And then maybe we could talk a little bit about potential methodological flaws.
Sure. Okay. So what they do in that study is that first I should say that Polzler and Wright have been at the forefront of identifying precisely the sorts of methodological confounds I've highlighted with the disagreement paradigm. So Polzler has a couple papers on this. Wright, in an early paper that was a sort of response and development on Goodwin and Wright, attempted to address some potential confounds. So they both have done work on that. And so what they've done in this particular paper, Anti-Realist Pluralism, it's a paper that came out in 2020, is they attempt to devise a new set of paradigms that corrects for and minimizes the influence of as many of these confounds as they reasonably think that they could manage to minimize. And so the whole point of this set of studies is to try to overcome the problems of the disagreement paradigm. Now, we've only hit the tip of the iceberg for the amount of methodological problems that there are. There are so many more that it would take hours to go through them all, like hours. So there are a lot of problems with it. So just very briefly, for instance, one of the things that they highlight is that the initial study, you might notice, it's only giving like seemingly like a relativist option and a realist option, but those aren't the only anti-realist positions that are around. It doesn't distinguish different types of moral realism like naturalism and non-naturalism, theistic and non-theistic conceptions, and it doesn't give people options like there are no moral facts at all. It's like there are no moral truths. That's not an option.
Yeah, and this is also, by the way, just ignoring the normative confound, which is they're only testing people's normative views and not even their metaethical views about whether or not the normative questions are stance independent. So
right, and so you're narrowly constraining people's response options in a way that is a serious problem. James Beebe actually introduced a third option, which is a non-cognitivist option, and it was for many of the responses, for many of the concrete moral issues, was the most commonly selected response. Taylor Davis also had a paper come out a few years ago where, again, the non-cognitivist, that not judging it's both are correct or one is correct, but there are no facts of the matter at all, it was the modal response, like the most common response that participants chose across a variety of concrete moral issues. And so there are at least some paradigms where when you do give other response options that aren't included, people do choose them. So what they did in this paper is they devised a range of both abstract, which is just asking people's metaethical views about morality, the domain as a whole, and about specific concrete moral issues. Again, just like many of the previous studies. So they have both abstract and concrete paradigms, and then they implemented a variety of different paradigms. Now, I don't want to get into all of them because it's too much to discuss all of the different ways that they measured people's metaethical views. But the point is that this was a within subject study, meaning that the same participants answered all of the different measures. So there's 6 or 7 different paradigms they employ. The same person did all of them. They did them for both the abstract and the concrete measures. Now, here's where their study starts to diverge from some of the earlier studies. And Wright also has another paper where some of these similar methods were employed. I call the types of study they employed training paradigms. Here's why. First, participants are given much more comprehensive instructions than previous studies. They also do their best to try to minimize confounds and confusions and biasing factors in the instructions. Like I mentioned, Goodwin and Darley actually imply that the other person is from the same culture, which is a problem. So they try to minimize those and give as clear and precise a set of instructions as possible. When participants are given response options, they also give them much more complicated, like they're full paragraph response options that lay out these distinct metaethical positions, and they have many more options to choose from. So they have more comprehensive response options. They have more comprehensive instructions. Then on top of that, they're given some degree of training in giving the relevant philosophical, in recognizing and drawing the relevant philosophical distinctions. For instance, people are given training in their ability to distinguish truth apt statements, propositions, from non-propositional remarks like close the door. It's not true or false. It's imperative. And so they're given training in evaluating and distinguishing those from one another. So that's the main reason I call them training paradigms. And then on top of that, after having done all that, they answer several comprehension questions that evaluate the degree to which they've understood the relevant conceptual distinctions. And so they're given all those instructions, they're given training, and then they're given basically a little quiz to see if all of that stuck and they get it. So you have them do all of that, and then you put them through these paradigms. And what they found is that consistently, and by consistent, it's like they chose the particular metaethical position, like most of the time, with exception of like once or twice. So basically, they had to choose it all the time, like every time or almost every time. 75% of the participants favored anti-realist responses consistently. That is a very high anti-realist rate, and it runs in the face of what I think most moral philosophers, at least in the contemporary discourse, have assumed, which is that most people are realists. So they found 3/4 of people seem to be consistent anti-realists. And in particular, people tended to favor cultural relativism and individual subjectivism. Non-cognitivism and error theory were not very popular. I mean, super unpopular. In fact, error theory, nobody was going for that. It was like 2-3%. Okay, so that finding is kind of remarkable given all of the careful extra stuff that they did. So you might think, okay, they did all this extra stuff, so they're really amping up the validity of the study. And so if the study is amplified to that degree in terms of its validity, and we get 3/4 anti-realism, this is maybe good evidence that most people are anti-realists. So now I guess we could get into some of the problems. Did you want to flag any concerns that you have?
The first one, and the most obvious one that comes to mind, is that aren't we supposed to be testing the views of non-philosophers? But we're sort of making these people into baby philosophers by giving them all this philosophical training. Like, here are the relevant distinctions. Here are the views in question. We have to test you to see if you get these. And then now that you're appraised of all this information, here are these questions. And now you can sort of, as you call it, spontaneously theorize about the questions. So you come to basically form an anti-realist view upon taking the study. And then or doing the study, and then you answer in light of that. So then you're not really testing their sort of native philosophical stances or commitments, but rather, I mean, you're sort of testing their kind of baby, spontaneously theorized stances and commitments. So that's the first one that immediately comes to mind, but I'm wondering if there are other problems, and if you want to elaborate on that one.
There are other concerns with the study. Some of them are, so that I take to be the most serious issue with the study. And that's a big theme that I develop on in the paper. And it's one of the big factors that underwrites the indeterminacy thesis that I end up defending. But there are some more minor concerns. I mean, at least one concern is that they didn't control for all the confounds. There might still be confounds there. And they also, Polzler, I think, either in another paper or Polzler and Wright in that paper explicitly acknowledge that it might not be entirely possible to completely eliminate the normative confound. It could be that people are still giving normative evaluations. I would add personally that social desirability and other factors like the ones you raised might also still be factors. But if you minimize everything else and you get it move in the direction of anti-realism, it could be that if you got rid of those other confounds, it'd bring it back down. But it really does seem to, all else being equal, push towards mostly non-philosophers or anti-realists. But there's a big concern. They drew on 2 sample populations, which is a college student population, and they drew on an Amazon's Mechanical Turk population. Now, what we do know from Beebe and Sakris's work on moral objectivism across the lifespan is that people in their late teens through their 20s are disproportionately likely to give anti-realist responses to the disagreement paradigm, and this is probably true of other, I would bet it's true of other paradigms. I don't think other people have done research where they're looking at different age categories. But what they find is that precisely the population that comprises the student population in these studies are disproportionately likely to give an anti-realist response relative to other age groups. And so insofar as the study is primarily composed of college students, it's a population that's disproportionately likely to give anti-realist response. The second issue is that the other participants were drawn from Amazon's Mechanical Turk in the United States. As far as I know, I don't know if they specified in the paper, but that's typically where people gather the data. And that might not seem, well, you might think, okay, well, it's just people taking surveys online. Here's the thing. Demographic research on people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk has found that they are much more likely to report being atheists or agnostics than the US population as a whole. In fact, the rate that they hit is something like 40%, which is way higher than the US population as a whole. And other research, Goodwin and Darley, 2008, the original paper, and research using a very different measure that does much better in validity checks, which is the Collier School et al. Paper, which is the moral relativism scale. both find a pretty significant association between religiosity and moral realism. And so you have like, especially relative to the rest of the world, but also relative to the rest of the US, a disproportionately non-religious population. And so you're getting an aggregate combination of people that are much less religious and in an age bracket that's much more likely to be anti-realist. And so you're getting these two demographic populations.
Yeah, to give responses that researchers interpret as anti-realist responses to questions, basically.
Sure. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that the people are realists or anti-realists, because I explicitly reject that. It's that all of this research is showing that people that are non-religious are more likely to give anti-realist responses interpreted as anti-realism, and that people that are in their late teens and early 20s are more likely to give responses interpreted as anti-realism, just to be really particular. And so the study is composed demographically. I could have just made this very simple. The study is demographically composed of people that are disproportionately likely to be non-religious or in their late teens and early 20s. Previous research shows that those populations are more likely to give anti-realist responses to questions. And so it does have it has a severe generalizability problem.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we've gone through the disagreement paradigm and lots of other studies, and this Polzler Wright one, which did a very commendable job of trying to rid the influence of a lot of these confounds. And their finding at least can give people pause, at the very least, who just confidently proclaim from their armchair that, oh yeah, everyone's just obviously everyone's a moral realist. I mean, but once you see this, it's like, I mean, it makes you step back. You're like, well, maybe I can't be so quick from my armchair to generalize like that. It's at least instructive in that regard. I don't know if you want to comment on that before we get into why all of these existing measures and their invalidity sort of leads you to folk metaethical indeterminacy.
I don't know how much I have to build on that. I just do want to stress that the spontaneous theorizing, can I mention that a little bit on that?
Yeah.
Okay. So like, just to really bring home what the problem is that recall that the research that researchers set out to conduct initially was folk metaethics. We're supposed to be studying the views of non-philosophers, but when you train people and you build up all that sort of like, you're training them to draw all the relevant conceptual distinctions and all that sort of stuff. Remember what I had mentioned earlier about research themselves coming from weird populations. You have this additional layer on top of that of people coming from weird populations, which is that philosophers have their own distinctive ways of thinking about things. They draw distinctions in particular ways. They conceptualize the sort of conceptual territory in particular sorts of ways. They create categories and distinctions and labels to refer to them. Now, when people are conducting these sorts of studies, it looks like they are jumping from the fact that within a very distinctive analytic philosophical tradition, philosophers draw, like they have categories A, B, and C. They seem to be presuming that non-philosophers already think implicitly or even explicitly in accordance with precisely those categories that the philosophers themselves have come up with. The presumption here seems to be, keep in mind, when you're conducting psychological research, you are measuring psychological constructs. You're measuring patterns in human behavior and judgment and thinking and mental states that are supposed to be like real phenomena that are actually reflective of the way that those people think. And philosophers that are conducting these studies, or even psychologists conducting these studies that are using the philosophical terms and concepts, seem to be presuming that the philosophical categories and distinctions that they use, so, positions A, B, and C, can be neatly reflected in psychological distinctions that non-philosophers draw implicitly or explicitly. I haven't seen any justification for this presumption. Why should we assume that these distinctions are reflective of the way that ordinary people were already disposed to think prior to them engaging in philosophy? It's an unusual presumption, and it's this sort of importation of philosophical categories and distinctions into psychology without careful thought about whether or not it's appropriate to do so. But the other problem is that, and I didn't mention this as serious of an issue as it is, this involves the use of a forced choice paradigm where the participants are told, hey, here's some categories. This is the way to think about things. Things go in category A, B, or C. Now we would like you to pick A, B, or C. Tell us which one you are. Now, if you want to participate in the study, you've got to pick A, B, or C. There isn't an option of D. I don't know what you're talking about. Please leave me alone. Now, also keep in mind, even if you were inclined to do that, if you're students in a class, you might not want to do that because you not going to get course credit. Is this going to be a problem? Is the professor going to be mad at you? Are they going to find out? If you're an Amazon Turk worker and you don't finish the full study, you might not get paid for participating. So people are going to answer the questions. And so they feel social pressure to, people may at least feel social pressure to select responses that don't genuinely reflect their actual beliefs for reasons outside the context of an actual attempt at assessing their beliefs. In other words, if I tell you, hey, I've got $5 if you answer a question for me, do you believe theory A or theory B? And you have no idea what I'm talking about. You might be like, theory B, I don't know. Don't not give me the money that you told me you were going to give me. That's not fair. And so I mean, people are incentivized to comply. And also, a lot of times people just want to comply. And also, it might not occur to you to not answer the question. You're A or B. Okay, I guess maybe it is A or B. They're telling me it's A or B. Maybe it is. So there's all of these factors that are going to influence the way that people respond in ways that may not reflect their genuine beliefs.
So, in light of all the preceding, how do you argue for folk metaethical indeterminacy? So, first, tell us what that is. But how do you argue for it, basically?
Right. So metaethical indeterminacy, it's not a view that originated with me. This was a proposal that was put forward by the philosopher Michael Gill in a paper back in 2009 on indeterminacy and variability. And so what Gill does, to give a little bit of context for this, is Gill says, look, if you look at 20th century metaethics, you see all these metaethical theories. You see the realists, or I guess you could say cognitivists, claim that all moral claims are propositions. They attempt to assert things that could be analyzed as true or false. Non-cognitivists deny this. Objectivists or realists think that moral claims describe a stance-independent reality. Relativists think they don't, and maybe they describe some stance-dependent reality. And so you have all these characterizations of the way that moral claims work, where the presumption is that when people go around saying things like murder's wrong, stealing's wrong, that's a good person, that's a bad person, that those claims share a uniform and determinate semantic analysis such that all of those claims have the same metaethical presuppositions or implicit in them. They are committed to conveying the same metaethical content. Gill says, okay, well, if you look at the way that philosophers have disputed these issues, what they'll often do is people on one or the other end of the dispute will pick one subset of sort of prototypical moral claims or features of morality, focus on those and say, look, that like the realist will say, look at these realist elements. It really looks like people, the non-philosophers are realists, folk are realists. And look, I understand there's some things that indicate that maybe they're not, but I can explain those away. But then if you go look at what the non-cognitivists are doing, the non-cognitivists might say, look at these factors related to expressing your attitudes and these motivational features of moral claims. It really looks like expressivism is true. And yeah, okay, sure. It's got this like structural features of it just like structurally, it looks like it's conveying a proposition, but I could explain that away. And so Gill looks at that dispute and says, well, maybe people aren't able to resolve these disputes in philosophy because we're presuming everybody has a uniform and determinate semantics. Maybe they don't. And so he proposes, okay, well, it might not be uniform. It might be pluralistic. It could be that sometimes people are realists of some issues and anti-realists about other issues. People sometimes speak like cognitivists, sometimes speak like non-cognitivists. So that's a pluralism thing. And as you can see, at first glance, the empirical literature really seems to indicate that might be the case. But Gill also proposes this other possibility. And for me, this was not initially the most appealing of the two. I went in for the pluralism initially. But the other possibility is that people have no determinate position at all. Now, that might sound really weird. You might think, well, people have to have a determinate position. They must think that when they make a moral claim, they're either asserting a proposition or not asserting. How could it be they're neither asserting a proposition nor not asserting a proposition? That doesn't even make any sense. But the issue here is not whether the person is asserting a proposition or not. I mean, that would be one potential question. There's at least two questions. And this is why the failure of researchers to be clear on what kinds of questions they're asking is really, really important. Keep in mind what I said initially, which is that for the most part, this research looks like it's looking at people's explicit beliefs or their stances. And so there's at least two separate questions here. When a person is making a moral claim, are they asserting a proposition or not? And then there's a second question, which is, what do they take themselves to be doing? And what do they take people to be doing in general? The second question is the question about their stance. Do they take the questions to be propositional or non-propositional? A person doesn't have to have a stance on that issue. And so right away, you can get indeterminacy about stances. And that's fairly straightforward. The person just doesn't have a belief about the matter. They haven't thought about it. When they're speaking, they're not operating on some theoretical commitment one way or the other that they would endorse or that they would even understand. So they just don't have a view about the matter. So that would be regarding stances. It's a little more complicated to talk about indeterminacy about commitments. But for me, a lot of that requires getting into the details of if we're describing what the what moral discourse is doing. And it doesn't have to be the case that in any given instance in which a person is using moral language, that it requires a particular type of analysis that best fits with one or another competing analysis. It could actually be in practice that it's underdetermined and that there's no particular analysis that does a better job of describing, say, the function of a language in any given context. And so that's a little more complicated to get into, but very roughly, what I'm expressing when I say that people may be metaethical indeterminacy may be true is that people have no determinate stances or commitments. They are neither moral realists nor anti-realists, and nothing about the way that they speak or think, or even the way that they act, decisively favors either a realist or an anti-realist interpretation of what they're doing. So if you go look at what people say and what people do, there's nothing there that is ever going to allow us to say these people are realists or these people are anti-realists. It actually can kind of fit with both. Or you could say, in a certain sense, it doesn't really fit with either, because the point is just that neither wins over the other.
Yeah, it's it's almost like pick some ordinary phenomenon. Like this may very well be the case with lots of like philosophical disputes about things in ordinary life. So in ordinary life, people make claims about what's like good or bad or right or wrong or what have you. And also in ordinary life, like people make claims about what causes what, like, oh yeah, this is causing inflation and whatnot. But there are lots of like philosophical theories, like higher level theories about like what causation is or what it amounts to. How do we analyze causation? Like are causal claims counterfactual claims implicitly or what have you? Or do we give a counterfactual analysis of causation or difference making analysis? Maybe do we give an analysis in terms of production or like causal powers or what have you? Or maybe we're reductionists about causation so that we can reduce it to like the direction of entropy or whatever. These are like higher level philosophical disputes about the nature of causation, which arguably when people are making claims about causation, like that such and such caused inflation, or like my dog caused my cup to spill over, like they don't have a determinate stance on either a determinate stance or like commitment about which of these particular analyses of causation is the correct one. It's like there doesn't seem to be an analysis which sort of like determinately captures everything that people are doing uniformly when they make causal claims. So anyway, that's sort of like an analogy.
Yeah. And so Gill uses one in his paper, and then I really lean into a big one for the paper, which I hope we'll have a little bit of time to talk about, because I think it's one of my funnest studies. I at least have fun with it. So Gill uses the distinction between mathematical Platonism and anti-Platonism, which I just think is really funny to think about. Like if you think about people adding up like a tip at a restaurant, when they're saying that, are they explicitly or even implicitly committed to mathematical Platonism or anti-Platonism? Or they're like,
yeah,
no,
like there are these non-spatiotemporal, necessarily existent abstract objects like numbers. That's what Platonism is, people. So are people determinately committed to that when they are making these claims about 1 + 1 = 2? That's sort of what you're
right. And when they're adding up the tip, for paying their bill or they're doing their taxes, they're not even required to be implicitly operating in a way that best fits Platonism or anti-Platonism. It's just, and what Gill says is basically just ordinary language just doesn't speak to them at matter. It's just not about that. Now, the example I lean into, and that's part of where the title comes into, is Schrodinger's categories.
Yeah, and let's get into the study that you did on that.
So it's kind of the titular study, even though it's not that important because it's kind of a satirical study, but whatever. Okay, so Schrodinger's categories. What I end up proposing in the dissertation is that what I say, and this relates back to the spontaneous theorizing with Polzler and Wright, is that I think for many philosophical issues, it's very much like a person's commitments to particular scientific theories, like how you interpret quantum mechanics, or your views about like, is group selection the correct account of like levels of selection in philosophy of biology, or just take your pick of many issues for which people they're not going around with implicit views on these matters and bumping around in their head. You have to learn about it and think about it and then take a stance on it. And so I think metaethics is like that. And in fact, I think many philosophical issues might turn out to be this way. But what I end up saying is that people exist in a sort of a philosophical superposition that is only collapsed by engaging in philosophy. And so there's nothing wrong with saying once you do philosophy, you'll tend, like the superposition is, there's a sort of philosophical wave function and you go one way or the other. and you don't remain in that indeterminate state indefinitely. But when you do, you could pick one. But the way that people already are inclined to speak and think may not, like the way non-philosophers speak and think, may just not tell us one way or the other because it's just absent from the way that people speak and think. So part of the way I wanted to illustrate this, and I actually got multiple tasks done with this one study, is here's what I did for a particular study. What I did is I said, okay, first, if you have a background in theoretical physics or something like that, I'm not going to analyze you. I didn't tell them that, but I asked people about their background in physics just so I could remove those people from analysis, because the goal was to figure out what people would say when I asked them about quantum mechanics. So what I did is I asked people about their educational background. That data is important. Do you have a background in physics? Do you have a view about quantum mechanics? That sort of thing. Now, most of the people for the study, which I did on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, were not theoretical physicists, and they didn't know much about quantum mechanics. And I specifically asked the participants, do you already have a view on how to interpret quantum mechanics? And the answer for most people was no. They don't have a view on how to interpret quantum mechanics. Why would they? That's not a thing most people have a stance towards. Okay, so first we have our participant pool, which is non-quantum physicists, is people that don't have a view about how to interpret quantum mechanics. Then I say, okay, well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about quantum mechanics. And so I give them a description of what quantum mechanics is, and then I give them two positions, the Copenhagen interpretation and the many worlds interpretation. Now, if your immediate reaction is, but wait, there's other interpretations. There's the Bohm interpretation. Yeah, too bad. They only got these two. So they get many worlds and the Copenhagen interpretations. And I'm not even going to get into what those are, other than to say that very crudely, the Copenhagen interpretation basically says that things are indeterminate and then it's sort of resolved randomly, whereas the many worlds interpretation is that the sort of every time there's a sort of juncture where a quantum event could go one way or the other, it goes in both and the universe splits into two. And this is just happening constantly. And so I give them those very crude descriptions, which, of course, they're not really going to have a comprehensive understanding of quantum mechanics. And then after they get that, then I ask them, which one of these positions do you endorse? And I sort of tongue-in-cheek report that 100% of participants chose one of those two responses. They were the only response options that they had. So of course, 100% of them did. And then I asked them a few follow-up questions after that. And one of those questions was, when you were answering this question, did you feel like you had to pick an answer that wasn't really reflective of your real views? Now, first of all, interesting finding, about 70% of people favored the Copenhagen interpretation. So that didn't surprise me. I thought the proportion would be higher because many worlds, I think, strikes many people as very, very far-fetched. But here's the thing about that, asking that question, did you feel compelled to answer in a particular way? It's kind of illustrates my concerns either way. Here's why. If they say they felt compelled to choose a response option that didn't reflect their actual views, that means that they responded in a way where the measure itself was invalid. They were responding to a question they don't endorse the Copenhagen or many worlds, and yet they did anyway. And my point there is that if you do the same thing in like the Polzler and Wright study, where you say, here's a bunch of metaethical concepts, pick one, and people pick one, it may or may not reflect their actual metaethical views. And so you have an invalid measure. Alternatively, let's say they did endorse the view. Well, keep in mind, I just asked them, like, if they're taking the study in like 5 minutes, they didn't have a view, they read a little paragraph thing, then they did have a view. So what just happened? They just developed a view in the midst of the study, spontaneous theorizing in practice. And that is lose-lose for researchers, because what it shows is they either didn't have a view and they had to pick one anyway, or they didn't have a view and then they did pick one and then they formed the view for the study. So what does that tell us about whether people that never took this study think about quantum mechanics? Not very much, because it doesn't tell us that they already are committed to a view about the Copenhagen or many worlds interpretation. And so that study I used to illustrate these problems of spontaneous theorizing and forced choice, and they can actually function in tandem to give you studies that can always give the superficial appearance of determinate positions. Notice, every single metaethical study we have, 100% of the people that participated in the study appear to have a determinate metaethical position. But they would have to. That's how the study is designed. There's no other option. And so it's very hard to make a case for indeterminacy when studies are structured in such a way where if the responses were artifactual, if they were not genuinely reflective of their views, it wouldn't matter because they would always look like they were reflective of their views. And so that was really, I think, an important study for illustrating that idea.
I just briefly want to highlight that I think you argue that sort of the best explanation for the difficulty of measuring folk metaethical views is indeterminacy. So I don't know if you wanted to briefly mention that kind of abductive argument before I ask you the last question and before we close it out.
Yeah, sure. So that isn't, of course, that's not the only reason that I infer indeterminacy here. There are a variety of reasons, and we're really just not in a position to get into all of them. But part of the reason that I take such a critical stance and believe indeterminacy is the best explanation of what's going on here is the sheer scope and pervasiveness of these unintended interpretations. Again, we've only touched on a few examples of them, but when I conducted this research, I conducted a bunch of research of my own. I mostly focused on my reanalysis of the Goodwin and Darley study. But what I also did is I asked people why they answered a variety of questions on a variety of metaethics scales. There's a bunch of metaethics scales out there. There's the relativism scale. There's the new metaethics questionnaire. I asked people how they interpreted those questions. Across all of those, when you code them for whether they clearly interpreted them with respect to the relevant metaethical concept that they were being asked about, the clearly intended response rates are astonishingly low. They almost never get over 20, 30%. In some cases, we had data where it was like 0.5% or like 1%. So of clearly intended interpretations. So we're talking consistently low for all of the metaethics scales. The relativism scale did the best, but it still was pretty low. We give people, you might think, well, maybe people don't have the appropriate language or terminology. So we gave we give a person a question and then a hypothetical person's written response to the question. Well, I think morality is true independent of people's goals or values. So we give them the answers. They don't interpret those questions in a way that's clearly, in line with researcher intent. We would give people, what else did we do? We ask about direct questions, like what does it mean to say morality is objective or relative? What does it mean to say that murder is wrong is objective? It's objectively true that murder is wrong. So you ask the explicit direct question. They don't interpret objective and relative in line with research intent. The proportions for that are super low. So the point is that when you go across all of these different ways of trying to see whether people interpret questions as intended, they consistently do not interpret them in line with researcher intent. Now, there is a tension here. There's a couple possible explanations. One explanation is that researchers have just failed to operationalize these questions appropriately. Maybe they would just need to do more work. And then we would have a valid measure of people's metaethical views. And that seems to be in tension with my claim that they don't have views, because if we don't actually have valid measures, we don't know that if we did have valid measures, we would get like good responses, and then we would know people's determinate views. However, I actually think that the problem is more fundamental, and that there's a reason why we're having a problem structuring the questions in the first place, which is that these questions, I think, they're presupposing that we can ask people about subtle, complicated technical concepts using ordinary language. And I don't think that we can. I just don't think that we can. I think we're asking people about technical questions, and to understand those questions, people would need the appropriate vocabulary or the appropriate way of being prompted to speak or think in accordance with what that vocabulary is effectively a shorthand for. You don't necessarily have to use technical terminology or mathematics to convey certain principles in physics, but people don't already understand complicated issues in physics. Even if you did your best to convey it without any technical jargon, they would still need to learn the relevant concepts. And so you have this kind of trade-off here, which is that absent adequate specification, clarification, follow-up questions, all the things you would need to do to make sure that people interpret your questions as intended, you have no idea if your measures are valid or not, and it doesn't look like they are, because you get this messy, inconsistent stuff that doesn't look like you're capturing substantive, consistent psychological constructs. It looks like a mess. The alternative is greater and greater and greater testing and specification, which is the route Polzler and Wright take, which is to give them more detailed instructions, to train them to do the concepts, to understand the concepts and to draw the relevant distinctions. The problem is, once you do that, as you pointed out, these people are, I call this philosophical induction. They are no longer non-philosophers. And so they're no longer representative of the population you're trying to study. And then the other problem is that, and these, again, are in tandem with one another, you can't distinguish in the context of that training whether the response is a result of the training or whether you're discovering the response they held all along and they've simply learned the appropriate language for expressing it. And so then you have this seemingly, to me, I don't know if it's irresolvable, but it's super duper hard to resolve under determination, where you just can't tell whether you're really capturing the view that they held all along. And so you have this trade-off where it's like, you go one way, you don't have a valid measure. You go the other way, you no longer have a non-philosopher's response. And so this, okay, how do we account for that? It could be that we just need to do more work, and that's a possibility. The other possibility is that the reason we face this tension is because there just isn't something there to measure. There just isn't a view. People just don't have a view until they get the training. And the quantum mechanics comparison is a good way of illustrating that. There's no good theoretical reason for supposing people are Copenhagians and mini world proponents. And so we wouldn't expect measures like that to be valid without explaining the concepts to them. And we wouldn't expect, if you trained people in quantum mechanics and then ask them, for that to be informative about what people without training in quantum mechanics think, because the whole point is that you develop the view because you studied quantum mechanics. And so it's the same issue here. And so if people do want to claim that ordinary people are implicit realists or anti-realists or explicit realists or anti-realists, they're going to need to somehow work around all of these problems. And I don't see a feasible way of doing that.
Yeah. And I think this is an interesting avenue for like further metaethical research as well. Just bring in metaethicists about this. Like, what are some of the other things that we can predict on the basis of the indeterminacy thesis? And do those predictions come out true? Do they come out false? Are there certain practical problems for that? Are there certain philosophical objections to it, and so on? So I think it's just a really interesting avenue for further research. So I just wanted to lay that in. If my channel can somehow influence the direction of metaethical research. Hey, I know that some professional philosophers watch this channel, so maybe it'll have an effect.
Yeah,
so
I should say there are limitations and problems with my research. Keep in mind, if I'm personally coding the research, I'm not unaware of my own expectations, and so there could be substantial personal biases. So one thing other metaethicists could do is code my data and see if they reach similar conclusions. The other thing that I would favor on this front is to do more bottom-up approaches rather than top-down. Rather than trying to impose metaethical categories on people and telling them they have to pick one, is to, in a way, try to elicit their views about the nature of morality without trying to put them in sort of pre-constructed boxes.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess the final question I had, and this was really, I mean, this is just a deceptive way. I shouldn't say this out loud, but this is just a deceptive way to try to get you to summarize all the threads that we've gone through. How would you respond to someone who came up to you on the street and said, hey, moral realism is the common sense view. Basically, every ordinary person believes it, whether explicitly or implicitly. How would you respond?
So I have a kind of the response that I always give when people say stuff like that, which is, that's an empirical question. I say that so frequently that I think people might start, maybe they already have, sort of making fun of me for saying that. But I say it because it's true. It is an empirical question. And so my first response to people that make those sorts of claims is that what I typically point out is that often when people draw these sorts of conclusions, they draw them on the basis of their own introspection and their own personal experiences with the way that they've interacted, like based on the way that they have interacted with people. Now, those are, for many questions, probably adequate to form a reasonable conclusion. But when it comes to psychological questions for which we have substantive empirical data that raises questions about the generalizability of our personal experiences. I come from a weird population. I don't have any experience outside of a weird population. Our ability to generalize to the way that everybody thinks is very, very limited. And I think the first thing I would suggest is that people, when it comes to these sorts of questions, one, these are empirical questions about human psychology, and two, that trying to do armchair metaethics is fraught with massive risk of substantial error. We need to get good, well-validated cross-cultural psychological research. One thing I also like to emphasize on this point is that many philosophers will say, look, in virtue of my competence, like my linguistic competence or my familiarity with the relevant concepts, I already have the requisite knowledge. I don't need to conduct empirical research. There are huge, huge problems with that. Part of the problem is that they might be presupposing that a particular way of thinking about language and meaning is the correct way of thinking about language and meaning. And you might be wrong about that. That is something that's up for grabs. I'm not obliged to accept your account of like philosophy of language. The other problem is simply that we already have empirical data that raises serious doubts about our ability to extrapolate from our own personal experiences. So the one thing, if we had no data at all, right? No data. Maybe, okay, then yeah, looks, I've talked to most people, they seem to be realists. I'm channeling a realist here, I'm not a realist. But if they said realism seems intuitive to me, it seems intuitive to most of the people I know, it stands to reason all being equal, most people are realists. There's nothing wrong with that inference. The problem is that we already have data that raises serious doubts about it. So I guess what I would say to people is, it's an empirical question. We have good reasons for doubting our ability to extrapolate from our own introspection and personal experiences. And there is growing empirical data that raises serious doubts about whether or not that's true.
Thanks, Lance, for coming on. I mean, do you have any closing comments before I do my concluding spiel?
Yeah. So one closing comment I would make it has to do with how a lot of people, I think, perceive the kind of approach I'm taking. So, and I think rightly so. Most of what I focus on is a sort of critical approach where I'm criticizing the validity of other people's research. I'm challenging a lot of the existing presuppositions and like I guess you could say longstanding dogmas in philosophy and maybe some in psychology as well. And that view can often give that sort of approach can often give the impression that I'm super pessimistic and I'm just looking to tear things down, and I don't think that there's anything positive to contribute. Um, I think it would be a little fun to say that's true. I just like destroying, but it's not. I do think that there is a constructive case to be made, but often that constructive case requires, if you really think that the state of a particular literature is really, really messed up, often in order to do things the way that you think would be productive and constructive and contribute something of value to the world, you got to deal with that stuff in you like first. So for instance, if you were a doctor and you were trying to study medicine and everybody was doing like alchemy or astrology or something, you show up at medical school and they're all consulting horoscopes and do whatever, doing homeopathy. You think, okay, well, homeopathy doesn't work. Astrology is not a good way to diagnose illnesses or treat people. I'm going to have to critique all of you so that we could do like legitimate medicine. Now, I am not saying that the psychological research that is done is the equivalent of astrology and that it's not valuable. Because now I realize that I might have made things sound even worse.
Well,
what I'm
this
saying
is an annoying problem that people always have. You'd make an analogy and you're just trying to make a single point with that analogy, and other people are saying, "Well, wait, are you saying that homeopathy is epistemically equivalent to like this psychological research?" Like, no, that's not what you're saying. You're making this point to draw out a different point. So anyway,
yeah, well, you really should do a video on that. Like, there needs to be a name for that. It's this problem of where when you're comparing two things along a single dimension, people, for whatever reason, either maliciously or unintentionally interpret you to be comparing it along every other dimension. And then they often react with incredulity or outrage. So if I say something like the sun and an orange are both roughly spherical, someone might react with, are you saying the sun and the orange are equivalent to one another? The sun is way bigger than an orange.
I can eat an orange.
And it's like, no, I'm not comparing them in terms of their edibility or how hot they are. So I'm not comparing them in any other respect other than their geometric properties. And so people have this problem of when you say, look, these two things are similar with respect to this property, they imagine you're comparing them with respect to other properties. Often they imagine you're comparing them conveniently in the least flattering way possible so that you optimally are saying the most outrageous thing that you could be saying. It's bizarre. It's like they're just like lunging at the most uncharitable interpretation.
Yes. Okay. I interrupted you. So go back. You're comparing.
But
you're saying.
Please do a video on that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Anyway, continue.
So I do think that there's something constructive to do here. So my own favorite approach here is to start incorporating research from philosophy and psychology. A lot of stuff in psychology that I think is super cool. So for instance, I think the argumentative theory of reasoning is a really cool theory which proposes that a big part of the way that human cognition functions when we engage in when we engage in reasoning is to facilitate argumentation and persuasion, and that a big part of it is about trying to basically navigate social hierarchies to win arguments, to, people, you could say roughly reason more like lawyers than like philosophers. Now, I think that might actually be a good description of the way that much of the way that moral language, as a matter of descriptive fact, functions. That moral language functions to facilitate, you could say very crudely, winning friends and influencing people. That the way that we use moral language largely is like you could switch from one mode to another, to seemingly realist language to seemingly anti-realist language, not because of a genuine commitment or explicit belief or any principled philosophical view where you're trying to be logically consistent, but just because certain language happens to be useful in one context for trying to condemn your enemies, to make yourself look good, to make your allies look good, to, basically have positive social benefits for you. And then you switch to a different mode of discourse in another context to achieve the same ends. And so what looks like inconsistency, what looks like a bug, is actually a feature. It's just a feature for a purpose that is very different from what we might have initially supposed. And so when we're looking at the nature of human discourse, including moral discourse, I think that we should shift our focus away from these top-down philosophical presuppositions. For whatever reason, psychologists seem to have just brought along the presumption of philosophers that when people are engaged in moral discourse, that they're deploying these like logically consistent and philosophically robust, sophisticated implicit theories that conform to the norms and concerns that motivate analytic philosophers. But why would we think that the way that moral discourse functions in the real world comports with the ideals of a highly idiosyncratic and insular group of academics in the 20th century? Why would it do that? We should just ask, like, what does it look like people are actually trying to do? And if you look at a lot of moral discourse, it doesn't look to me like people are trying to get at the moral truth. It looks like trying to look good and imply that their enemies are jerks. And so maybe that's not a misuse of the language. Maybe that would be more properly understood as what the language is functioning to do. And so I do think maybe that's a rather unpleasant way of describing moral language, but it might just be descriptively accurate. And so I do think that there's a positive thesis to put forward. But I think before we do that, we have to clear out the presuppositions that were motivating the research in the first place.
Awesome. Well, I hope this was really informative to you guys in the audience. Thanks again, Lance, for coming on. I really appreciated this. And again, for the audience, I will link Lance's dissertation in the description. Who knows if Lance finds the time? I'm not pushing this on him, but he might find himself in the comment section. We'll see. As he very often does, he has this spider sense for when moral realism discussions get posted, and then he shows up and then jumps on people and tells them why they're wrong, or explains to them why they're wrong. So I'm sorry if I'm characterizing you negatively. I think it's admirable. So anyway, that's why Lance is awesome. That's why we all appreciate you. Okay. What was I going to say at the end? Yeah, if you guys see value in the work that I do, please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Any amount helps. I'm going to be a lowly grad student very soon, very, very soon. And while I'm going to be on a stipend, that does not cover a lot of stuff. So anyway, you guys' help on Patreon, it makes so much of a difference to my life. It's the wind in my sails. It helps keep Majesty of Reason afloat. So thank you guys so much. And what better way to end is there than? I'm Joe Schmid. This is the Majesty of Reason, and peace out.